In this video, we'll have the opportunity to consider some historical observations associated with 1st and 2nd Kings. We'll begin with several slides presenting text, and then we'll switch over to look at some maps and also some photos. The historical observations you see here are a loose collection. So, for example, it's good to be aware early on in 1 Kings 1 that as Solomon takes the throne and we see him mounted on a mule, this would have been recognized by the onlookers as a sign of royalty. Next, we learn that Solomon marries a daughter of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Who would this Pharaoh have been? The name is not given in the biblical record, but we suspect that it would have been Pharaoh Siamun. As you may know, the Egyptian monarchy is categorized with various dynasties, and Pharaoh Siamun belonged to the 21st dynasties. It's thought that he would have agreed to this marriage arrangement, since that would have helped Pharaoh Siamun strengthen his ties with Israel, since he wasn't strong enough at that time to rule over Israel militarily. Incidentally, you see the reference credit given to a resource called the Bible Backgrounds Commentary. I highly recommend this particular resource because of the ease of its access. Just within one hardbound book, you can get a scattering of interesting historical insights across all of the Old Testament. The more complete name of the resource is the IVP, that is InterVarsity Press, Bible Background Commentary of the Old Testament by Walton, Matthews, and Chavalis. Third, we encounter a monarch in Tyre known as Hiram. 1 Kings 5. There's only one other mention of him outside the Bible. An extra biblical reference is found in Josephus, and we want to acknowledge that this would have been centuries later than his actual life and rule. In contrast to that, another individual, Hiram II, is well attested outside the Bible. Fourth, this observation regarding the dedication of the Solomonic Temple, 1 Kings 6. We learn that it's in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, which was located in about 966 BC. We are told that this occurred 480 years after the Exodus, the rescue out of Egypt. By dating the Exodus precisely, in quite strict fashion, dating the Exodus 480 years prior to the 966 dedication of the temple, that would put the Exodus at 446 BC. This is one way to date the Exodus. Some wonder whether or not we should be treating the 480-year figure as a strict chronology and suggest instead that perhaps this was a round number, so that, for example, as you see in parentheses, perhaps it was 40-year lifespan of 12 judges or 12 generations, so a round number, in which case then the Exodus wouldn't have happened at 1446, but some period on either side of that. A fifth historical observation, we are given the dimensions of the temple, and if you convert it from cubits to feet, we have a structure that is 90 feet in its run, 30 feet by 40 feet high. Mention is made of stones that were used in the palace construction, and they measure up to 15 feet long. Later on, you'll see some photos of stones that are used in the Temple Mount foundation, and some of these run 40 foot in length and may be estimated to be 100 tons. Clearly, the Herod's temple situation was centuries later than Solomon's palace. Nevertheless, it gives us an idea of the engineering capability of the ancients. We want to be aware, seventh, that Elijah's confrontation with Ahab's prophets of Baal took place on Mount Carmel, a location, a promontory overlooking the Jezreel Valley. We'll have occasion to look at this in map and photo. Eighth, there are a series of international figures, that is, non-Israelite figures, that play into the history of Israel as they have hostile encounters with foreign nations. We've mentioned a few already. for example, the non-hostile connection with Pharaoh Siamun through marriage, but then these international figures that you see listed here. In 2 Kings 15, the Hebrew Bible refers to a monarch outside the Israelite community known as Pul. And we understand that this was an alternate name referring to someone we know from the Akkadian or the Assyrian records as Tiglath-Pileser III. Tiglath-Pileser III was a ferocious leader responsible for the revival, the military resurgence of the Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. 745 is when he got rolling, and he was a terrific menace to be dealt with. NK is used as abbreviation here for Northern Kingdom king by the name of Menachem in Israel, relinquished tribute to Tiglath-Pileser III. Next, we'd like to mention some problem that the northern king Jehu ran into. It's an event that's not recorded in the Bible, but is very fascinating to us because there is an archaeologically recovered feature, an obelisk, a black obelisk, that gives us Shalmaneser III of Assyria his recollection and freezing this event in time, a time when he subjugated various leaders, including the king of Israel, and he names him Jehu. And we have that then corresponding and confirming one of the major kings of the northern Israel that's recorded in the Bible. That would have taken place right around 841 BC. Once again, that the name Jehu is in the Bible. The event of him relinquishing tribute to Shalmaneser III is not mentioned in the Bible, but you'll see a photo later on of a black obelisk that gives us the Assyrian record of that event that happened in Israel. Now, Shalmaneser V of Assyria is a major figure in the biblical account. He's not named as Shalmaneser V, he just goes by the name Shalmaneser, but we know from Assyrian records that more accurately he's Shalmaneser V. What made him especially memorable in the Israelite history is that he's responsible for laying siege to the northern kingdom, in particular the capital, Samaria, which capital fell after a 3-year siege in 721. We read of this in 2 Kings 17. Now, later on, another Assyrian king by the name of Sennacherib is mentioned in the Bible. 2 Kings 18 and 19 give us another siege of a capital, but this time it's not Samaria, since by now Samaria is off the map. That is to say, it's no longer in Israelite control. This time under Sennacherib, it's the siege of Jerusalem. The year here is 701. Now notice this is not the fall of Jerusalem. That will happen later, around 586. But this is a major siege of Jerusalem. You can read of it in 2 Kings 18 and 19. The monarch on the throne is Hezekiah, 701. Pharaoh Necho makes his way up from Egypt in 609 BC. Incidentally, he is not really seeking to tangle with the Jewish empire, Jewish kingdom, but King Josiah, who is naturally southern kingdom king, since, again, the northern kingdom of Israel is off the map, is not operating at this time, having fallen in 721. Josiah resents the incursion, the trespassing of Pharaoh Necho with his armies and intercepts him, and unfortunately Josiah is killed by Pharaoh Necho's troops. Pharaoh Necho's objective, incidentally, was to head up to Carchemish and prop up the Assyrian Empire, which was being threatened by the Babylonians. And along the way, he tangles with Josiah. You'll see the reference to Necho in this presentation, sometimes spelled N-E-C-O, sometimes N-E-C-H-O. Depending on what resource you use, you'll find it spelled variously. Another international monarch by the name of Nebuchadnezzar enters the record. Sometimes he's referred to as Nebuchadrezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is a bit more customary. 2 Kings 24 tells of Nebuchadnezzar coming and taking some captives exile. Among them, incidentally, will be Daniel. And that happens in 605. Daniel's southern Israel king is Jehoiakim. at that time. Nebuchadnezzar will come back in 587, and this time he will take among his exiles the king of southern Israel, Jehoiakim, and with him, incidentally, the prophet Ezekiel, along with many other captives. It may be worth mentioning relative to Nebuchadnezzar and the exile of Daniel, although Jehoiakim was the king at that time, he was not exiled. Let's go over some of the prominent dates in this period and a few dates that go beyond 2 Kings, just to give a frame of reference for some later important events. 721, this is a date worth locking in memory. It's just a very, very valuable a foothold of major events in Israelite history, along with things like the start of the Solomonic, or the monarchy with Saul around 1100. Here's another one then. 721 is the date when the Assyrians take down the northern capital, Samaria, and that's the end of northern Israel. Shalmaneser V, or according to some Babylonian, or rather Assyrian records, a successor, Sargon II, may have been responsible for that. A little bit unclear as far as who actually deserves the credit for taking down Samaria. The siege lasted 3 years. Can you imagine being locked into a city for 3 years? 701 then is when Sennacherib, also of Assyria, lays siege to Jerusalem and cages up King Hezekiah. We'll talk more about that later. You may have noticed that while it was the Assyrians that conquered northern Israel, it's not the Assyrians but the Babylonians that conquer southern Israel. Clearly then there's been a shift of power as the Babylonians have replaced the Assyrians. The year 712 helps us index that event, which is not something happening in Israel at all. It's happening off to the east. And here's what happens. As Babylon, the Babylonians gain power, one of their key turning points is when they can capture the Assyrian capital, Nineveh. That's 612. 605, we're interested in what is happening to various key biblical figures. 605 is when the first group of exiles are taken from southern Israel, and Daniel's among them. Nebuchadnezzar is the one responsible for that deportation, while Jehoiakim is king. 597, then again, another exile from southern Israel. King Jehoiakim and prophet Ezekiel are taken captive. It's still Nebuchadnezzar who's carrying this out. 586 is when Jerusalem falls, and here's another major date. 721 for the fall of Samaria in the north, 586 for fall of Jerusalem. Worth memorizing these, just so when these events go by and you're reading biblical material or you're studying some of the prophets, you can have a sense of when those happened. 721 and 586. If you haven't memorized them already, please do it now. Jerusalem then falls to Nebuchadnezzar. It takes half as long to besiege Jerusalem as it does Samaria. Samaria 3 years, Jerusalem 18 months. That's not a value statement, that just indicates what happened. And that resulted in extensive deportations to Babylon. You have a fairly weak group of people that are remaining in Israel after the fall of Jerusalem. Now the remaining three dates you see on the screen, 538, 516, and 445, are not mentioned in with the limited materials that we're working with as this course concludes with 2 Kings. Our study here just goes through 2 Kings. But as you know, some exiles were allowed to return to Israel, and you may be wondering how long did it take for that to happen. It was in 538 that Cyrus the Persian, yes, that's right, we started with Assyrians, then we moved to Babylonians. It will be the Persians under Cyrus who issue the Edict of Restoration, and they allow the Israelites, and incidentally not just the Israelites or Jews, but basically anyone, any exiles that they had inherited from the Babylonians whom they overthrew, any of those exiles from other lands, they said to them, you can go home now. Jews benefited from that, and so they make their way back. Haggai and Zechariah are prophets that inspired the people to rebuild the temple. That's happening in that time frame of 538. You can see that finally the temple is built there in 516. 516 is when the temple finally is rebuilt. Nehemiah, you may be aware of this book and its place as far as relating some of the history of post-exilic Israel. The Jews getting out of Babylonian exile, so that's why it's called post-exilic, and making their way back to Israel. That didn't happen for, what shall we say, about 60, 70 years later, after the temple is rebuilt. Then comes Nehemiah's ministry, and he stirs the people then to build a protective structure around the city, rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem. Let's give our attention to a series of maps that will help us picture the territory affected by these various groups and various events. These maps, incidentally, as you can see on the side, are from the Holman Bible Atlas, and the numbers indicate the number of the map. So here we have map 57. I'm able to display these digitally because they're part of the Logos Bible software material, which is a great tool to have. So you can just kind of copy and paste them if you have Logos and use them in your teaching or preaching. So here's an overview then. The green at the top gives us a picture of the northern kingdom of Israel. Obviously this would be after, around 950, when the kingdom divides under Rehoboam. The purplish in the south then is principally Judah. This is labeled the Assyrian threat. We can see that Assyria there, particularly in the red zone, but then spilling over to the green zone, is the power, the international power off to the east. Their primary capital, they're not only Ashur, but especially Nineveh, up there at the top of the yellow zone, here roughly in the right center. This map gives us the pathways of deportation of Israelites by the Assyrians, and we're thinking here, especially in 721, some of this would have been similar pathways for the later deportation to Babylon as well, but this map is intending to show the deportation of the northern kingdom, particularly these green lines showing areas where northern Israelites tended to settle or to be forcibly settled. When I mentioned that the deportation of southern Israelites would follow some of these routes, I was thinking especially of the mentioned portrayal here of Babylonia, and with some pathways. On this map, they're intended to show the direction of foreigners that were leaving. They were displaced by the Assyrians from Assyria and forcibly settled into northern Israel. It will be basically the reverse pathway that in 605, 597, and 586, later the Babylonians will seize Israelites and bring them from southern Israel into Babylonia. Here's another picture of just how wide was the authority and spread of the power of Assyria. Notice that it's reaching even down into the Nile Valley. This was a very powerful empire. Now, when we focus on Sennacherib's campaign against Judah, and here we're thinking of the year 701 BC, 701, Sennacherib, Assyrian. I'd like you to notice this map because although our biblical record will concentrate on just a few cities, and especially Lachish, you might want to notice that in the lower center. We'll return to that later. Sennacherib will besiege and conquer Lachish, and then he'll make his way to Jerusalem subsequent to that, and he will besiege, but he will not conquer Jerusalem. If you can read the fine print here, the box reminds us that there's a miraculous intervention. The Assyrian army is defeated. The other bits of information that this particular map assists with is it helps us to realize that in addition to those focal Israelite engagements, Sennacherib is very busy all over Palestine. We have note here of the Egyptians coming up and tangling somewhere between Ashdod and El Teke, and Sennacherib defeats the Egyptians. So Sennacherib is not just making a beeline to Jerusalem, he is steamrolling over all kinds of towns along the way, and especially taking on some fortified cities of Israel, which is very terrifying to the Israelites. We're switching now to the Babylonian Empire. More technically, as you see in the inset, the Neo-Babylonian. Also the Assyrian, as we're talking about Tiglath-Pileser III in 745 and so on. That's the Neo-Assyrian. Those designations simply indicate to us that there was an Assyrian Empire before the Neo-Assyrian. There was also a period of time when there was a Babylonian Empire prior to the Neo-Babylonian. So these are resurgence empires. Typically, when we look at the positioning of the Babylonian Empire, we basically see that this is the Assyrian painted with a different color. Admittedly, it's starting out a little bit further south, and Babylon is capital instead of Ashur, a power center, or Nineveh, which were major centers for the Assyrians. And here you see the Assyrian a little bit to the north, Babylonians to the south. But when the day is over, they're going to control the same territory that the Assyrians did predominantly. This is a good map for us to locate a very important international location site, Carchemish. Carchemish. When we talk about Pharaoh Necho traipsing through Israel and tangling with Josiah, you can see the inset of that over here. Josiah is killed in battle with Necho II. Necho is making his way up the coast in order to prop up the failing Assyrian Empire at the battlefield of Carchemish. The Babylonians are weakening Assyria, and Pharaoh Necho hopes to defeat the Babylonians in order to prop up the Assyrians. So Carchemish is that location. Very major battle there, a couple of times actually. In fact, this map will help us close in on the Josiah event. So here we have Jerusalem in the highlands, roughly on the same latitude as the northern edge of the Dead Sea. If you're looking at a map that doesn't give Jerusalem, just locate the top of the Dead Sea and then head west a bit into these highlands. And so we expect that Josiah would have trekked through, perhaps due north, through some friendly territory in order to intercept Pharaoh Necho, who's making his way up along the coastal highway. This is a well-established international route in the ancient time. Even before, I'm quite confident this route would be established even long before Joshua shows up in Israel, in Palestine through the conquest. So this is a well-known route. It would be the natural route for Pharaoh Necho to take. This would have been the shortest distance between 2 points, the Nile Delta in the south, and Carchemish, as you saw in the Euphrates, far to the north. As he's trekking along, then Josiah says, "Hey, I resent the fact that you're rolling through my territory." But unfortunately, despite the fact that Josiah is fundamentally one of those rare good kings of southern Israel, he loses his life in tangling with Pharaoh Necho and his troops. Incidentally, Pharaoh Necho is not going to just say, sorry about that and have a nice day, but he establishes then his authority over Israel right then. Well, after one brief king, I think he lasted only about 3 months, Pharaoh Necho then establishes another king. He is a Davidic descendant. So it's not as though he brings in an Egyptian prime minister and puts him in place. He does promote a Davidic descendant, so there's no break in the Davidic monarchy line that God promised to Israel. But he is clearly under the thumb. He's controlled. He's selected presumably because he will be faithful to Pharaoh Necho. And that lasts for a little while, but then the Babylonians roll in, and then Pharaoh loses his power over Israel. So here we have portrayal, helping us graphically to see this event, 609, wasn't it? 609 BC. And now Nebuchadnezzar comes into Israel, and you can see these lines of approach coming from the northeast, making his way down around the Sea of Galilee, trekking by Megiddo. This is a major route. Incidentally, do you notice this little section where the cursor is? This northwest to southeast stretch running from Mount Carmel, which is the little jut out, the little tooth that sticks out into the Mediterranean, and then Megiddo partway down here, and then running down to the Jordan River Valley. This itself is a valley. The reason there's a route here is because this is a depression zone. It's a plain. It's a very easy transit. It runs right down here to, there's a settlement, Beth Shean, roughly where the Jezreel, it's called the Jezreel Valley, all right? The Jezreel Valley right along here. Very, very important physical feature leading to the Jordan Valley. So again, what we're looking at here are the various ports of call in the hostile engagement of Nebuchadnezzar coming in and giving, creating some harassment, and some deportation in Israel. Let me back that up and just notice the various campaigns. We mentioned them already. First campaign, 604. I think I'd given the date 605. That's when Daniel is deported. And then the second campaign, 598 or 7, and that's when Jehoiakim and Ezekiel are exiled. And then Nebuchadnezzar comes a third time, 587-86. That's the beginning of the 18-month siege of Jerusalem, leading in its defeat. And then a few months later, the temple is burned, the city is burned. There's another useful piece of information here, an Egyptian campaign, 604 to 601. And we'll mention this a bit later. There was a period of time when, as the Babylonians are creating difficulty for Israel, an Israelite king will reach out to the Egyptians. Actually, the Egyptian campaign is just this lower portion here in the very far southwest, coming up to Gaza. And the Egyptians will give a brief bit of respite, a response to the invitation, the cry for help from Jerusalem, but it won't last long. And so after a brief reprieve, then the Babylonians come back and crush Jerusalem. Here then we see a map of the gradual exile, the exile in 3 stages from Judah, southern kingdom, to Babylonia. You can see it's roughly the same as northern Israel being distributed into Assyria, although those destinations were a little bit further north. And now we understand that the Babylonians brought the Israelites right into Babylonia itself in this region. This historic event came home a bit to me when I had the privilege a few years ago to go on a brief visit to Israel. A tour guide of ours, when we were asking his background, as you know, many people have emigrated back to Israel since 1945. And this individual, we said, so where are you from? We thought perhaps he's from Eastern Europe, maybe Russian or something, living in Germany, or ancestors in Holland or something like this, and pushed out from the hostilities that they suffered from the Third Reich. But no, he said, my parents lived in Iran. So I didn't stop to ask how many generations back, but we knew that there were flourishing Jewish communities in the territory of what's now modern Iran or Iraq for centuries back. And if you ask the question, well, as we would say, what's a good Jewish boy like you doing in a place like Iran? Well, the answer is very plain. For a number of those people, it would be just think of what happened in 586. We got torn out of our homeland and we were dropped into Babylonia. Now, I don't know if in the case of our tour guide, if his parentage reached that many centuries back, but it very well could have. It may have been that he was part of the Jewish community for all those centuries, dating back to 586 BC, and only recently then made his way back to Israel. What's fascinating about that is these people did not lose their heritage, their identity, their culture. Certainly some of their culture was lost, but we know flourishing Jewish communities in Babylonia. One of the evidences of the sustained community of Jews who were exiled from Israel and made their way to Babylonia is a document known as the Babylonian Talmud. Now, there are other Talmuds. There's the Jerusalem Talmud, but also there's this Babylonian Talmud, and it is a commentary basically on Hebrew Scriptures. It dates from the 1st to the 7th century A.D., and it's the product of the Jewish community living there outside Israel, but maintaining their culture, their religion, as much as they can without having access to a temple, which of course is very, very central to the Jewish faith. But it's just that Babylonian Talmud is a literary reminder of the sustained identity of the Jewish culture and community outside of Israel as a result of the exile. I've included this map because as we come to the very last chapter of 2 Kings, we read that Gedaliah was installed by the Babylonians as a governor over the remnant in Israel, in Judah. Jeremiah is still with them, incidentally. But some of the people, some of the Israelites, the Jews, resent this Gedaliah, and they assassinate him. And then it occurs to them that they have incurred the wrath of the Babylonians who put Gedaliah in place. They will take this as an immensely hostile act and feel they need to squash the Israelites, the Jews, for murdering their appointed governor Gedaliah. And so the Jews gather things up. They also gather up Jeremiah against his counsel and will, and they whisk themselves off to Egypt. And that then is one of the last comments that we learn about, the accounts we learn about concerning the Jews in southern Israel after the fall of Jerusalem. And this map indicates the pathway. It even indicates that down here in Elephantina at the far south, upriver the Nile, there was later discovered a Jewish military colony and a structure that's understood to have been a temple of a Jewish sort. This next slide is going to look at and review a number of these historic events. It's one that I've put together to support an understanding of what's going on in Jeremiah's life. Since Jeremiah is ministering at the close of the southern kingdom, then the events leading up to that give us a nice way to review. So let me just roll through this leading up to a presentation of when Jeremiah lived, and that will help us recap these events. The layout as you see it, you'll find the Assyrian Empire is shown above the upper blue bar. Southern Israel, particularly southern Israel, is between the two blue arrows, the two lines, and then Babylon, Media, and Egypt will be located there. Various rulers will be located below the lower blue bar. So Ashurbanipal, Sin Sharishkun, a couple of leaders in Assyria, and during their relative rules, we have King Josiah. We also have ministry of Zephaniah and Habakkuk as prophets. Now, Nabopolassar comes on the scene at this time. This then is when Babylon is beginning to push back against Assyria. In Media, Cyaxares II, not a major force yet, but he is on the scene. And let's see what happens. Nabopolassar in 612 then knocks on the door of Assyrian capital Nineveh. Here is where Babylon is tipping the scales in their favor and beginning to overwhelm the Assyrian Empire. Pharaoh Necho II, incidentally, his Egyptian name, one of his Egyptian names, oftentimes the pharaohs had more than one, Wahemi Bra of the 26th dynasty. You can see the span of his reign. And as we commented before, in 609, he makes his way up the coast and tackles the Babylonians in order to delay or to counteract the Babylonians beginning to overwhelm the quasi-allies of Egypt, namely the Assyrian Empire. Along the way, Pharaoh Necho tangles with Josiah, or perhaps we'd say Josiah tangles with Pharaoh Necho. Keep in mind, where is Necho bound for? He wants to go all the way up north to Carchemish on the Euphrates. On the way, he goes through Megiddo. Remember that town there, just southeast of Mount Carmel, overlooking the Jezreel Valley, and Josiah loses his life at Megiddo. Jehoahaz reigns after Josiah very, very briefly, and then Pharaoh Necho establishes Jehoiakim, selected by Egypt. You see that there in 609, following Josiah. So Jehoiakim is appointed by Egypt. Along about this time, then, after the 605 Carchemish, A605 Carchemish battle related to that, Nebuchadnezzar is leading Babylon, and he will be the big name then as far as harassing and overwhelming southern Israel. Nebuchadnezzar, during Jehoiakim's reign, will roll into Israel, and even though Jehoiakim has been set up by Egypt, Nebuchadnezzar, that doesn't faze him at all. He says, I don't care who sets you up. I've got more powerful forces, and I am conquering, exerting my power over Israel and taking some captives, exiling them, and Daniel is among that group. Jehoiakim then follows Jehoiakim, and he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar, getting his attention. Nebuchadnezzar rolls in and says, enough of this. There is another deportation. Jehoiakim himself is deported, very humiliating to Israel. Ezekiel the prophet is part of that group, which find themselves forcibly taken to Babylonia. Zedekiah then is set up by the authorization of Babylon. He's still a Davidic line king, but he's one selected and authorized and in essence sworn allegiance to the Babylonian Empire, which works for a while until Zedekiah opposes that. Basically, they're saying we don't want to pay taxes. We don't want to be under that kind of obligation to Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. Nebuchadnezzar does not take kindly to that, comes in 586 and establishes a siege against Jerusalem. In that period of time, perhaps just a little before the siege began, Zedekiah reaches out to Egypt. You might recall that map that showed a kind of a beige pathway coming up from the Egypt zone towards Gaza, the Egyptian forces. Well, he appeals to Hophra, whom we understand would go by his Egyptian names, either Apirez or Wahibre of the 26th dynasty, the same dynasty as Pharaoh Necho. And for a period of time, the Babylonians recoil from the threat of the Egyptians, but unfortunately that does not last. And then Nebuchadnezzar sets up the siege proper, which lasts 18 months, at the end of which Jerusalem is defeated and the southern kingdom of Israel is no more. Captives are deported to Babylon to join those such as Daniel and Ezekiel who are already in Babylonia. And it's during that time frame that Jeremiah is serving as prophet. Jeremiah is a wonderful book, powerful, a pathos-filled, just a very grief-stricken book, and with severe indictments for the leadership and people of Israel. We don't hear much about about Jeremiah in the book of Kings, but he is operating in the background, and as you read the book of Jeremiah, then you know where to slot his ministry over against the chronology and and successive kings. You can see he starts off in Josiah. He has quite a long ministry. And so we want to use books like the Books of Kings to give us a frame of reference for the various prophets. That's one of the great values and contributions of the Book of Kings, not to study it in isolation, but to let it inform what were the conditions like when these various prophets were raised up by God with their pungent messages. We'll conclude this section of the historical study at this time, and then set up another video which will present various photos that will help introduce some of the territory that is described in the Books of Kings.